Look at this headline. Zimbabwe, 2025 record agricultural exports. Over $1 billion in cash. From a country most people still picture as the graveyard of money, where inflation once ate everything. That turnaround didn't come from new technology, didn't come from foreign aid or government reform. It came from a quiet agreement, almost invisible, almost unspoken, involving the same white farmers who were violently expelled from this land 25 years ago. They never officially came back. And yet somehow, they're the ones running the machines. By 2024, something quiet had been happening across Zimbabwe's farmland. Not announced, not celebrated, barely acknowledged in official government statements. But if you looked closely at the paperwork, the permits, the land use agreements, the quietly filed joint venture registrations, you would find a number that stopped you cold. More than 2,400 joint ventures, 2,400 formal arrangements between black landholders and white agricultural investors, approved and registered across the country. Not one or two experimental pilot programs, not a handful of politically connected exceptions. 2,400. That number tells you something important. It tells you this wasn't an accident. It wasn't a loophole that slipped through the system. It was the system quietly correcting itself because it had no other choice. Here's what that correction actually looked like on the ground. The black landholders had the title legal ownership, government issued, constitutionally protected. The land was theirs, but land on its own doesn't produce anything. A commercial tobacco farm isn't just soil and seed, it's a supply chain. It's a network of seasonal lenders who extend credit in October because they trust you'll deliver product in April. It's relationships with international buyers, buyers in Belgium and Germany and China who have been dealing with the same names, the same families, the same reputations for 30 years. It's knowledge of exactly when to irrigate, how deep to cure the leaf, which grades command premiums on which markets. And that knowledge doesn't live in a government document. It doesn't transfer with a land deed. It lives in people. And the people who had it, the white commercial farmers, had mostly left. So the joint ventures became the mechanism through which that knowledge came back. A white farmer would return, not as an owner, not as a title holder, but as an operational partner. He would bring the seasonal finance, the crop input credit, the cold chain logistics contacts, the international buyer relationships that had been sitting dormant for 2 decades, waiting. The black landholder provided the legal right to farm the ground. The white farmer provided everything that made farming that ground commercially viable. And the results were not subtle. Tobacco production. Zimbabwe's single most important export crop, the one that had collapsed so catastrophically it became an international case study in agricultural destruction, began to recover. It climbed back through the floor, then through 200 million kilograms, then past 300 million. By the time the 2024 figures were compiled, Zimbabwe had recorded tobacco output of 353 million kilograms from a sector that had been functionally dead. The irrigation systems that had sat idle for years began operating again because someone who understood how they worked was standing next to them. The curing barns came back online. The cold storage facilities that had been locked and rusting since the early 2000s were reopened, repaired, and put back to work. None of this happened because the government launched a new agricultural policy. None of it happened because of foreign aid packages or development bank programs. It happened because the people who knew how to run these systems were allowed back through a side door, a door that officially didn't exist, into arrangements that no one at the top wanted to speak about too loudly. The uncomfortable truth that these 2,400 joint ventures represent is this. You can redistribute land. You can sign the decree, hold the ceremony, hand over the keys. But you cannot redistribute the 20 years it takes to build a line of credit with an international commodities buyer. You cannot redistribute the institutional memory of a farming operation that took 3 generations to build. You cannot redistribute trust. And when you destroy those things, when you sever them overnight with a political decision, you discover, slowly and painfully, that getting them back requires exactly the people you expelled to carry them back in. That is what Zimbabwe spent 2 decades learning. And that is what 2,400 quiet agreements, signed without fanfare, finally began to rebuild. Forget the photographs of empty supermarket shelves. Forget the news footage of people pushing wheelbarrows of banknotes through the streets. Those images are real, but they're the end of the story. They're the smoke. The fire started somewhere else, somewhere most people never looked. In the year 2000, Robert Mugabe signed a series of fast-track land reform decrees. The stated goal was redistribution. The land had been concentrated in white hands for generations, and that was a genuine injustice, one that stretched back to colonial legislation that had locked black Zimbabweans out of the most productive agricultural zones for most of the 20th century. The anger behind the reform was real. The historical grievance was legitimate. But what happened next had almost nothing to do with farming. 4,000 commercial farms were seized, not gradually, not through a structured buyout process or a negotiated legal framework, They were seized, often violently, often within days, and transferred to political allies, war veterans, and government loyalists, most of whom had no commercial farming experience and no connection to the land they were handed. Here's the part that almost no one talks about. When those 4,000 farms changed hands, the banks that had lent money against them didn't get a phone call. They didn't get a warning. They woke up one morning and found that their collateral had legally ceased to exist. Under the new arrangements, agricultural land became state property. You could occupy it, you could farm it, or try to. But you could not pledge it to a bank. You could not use it as security for a loan. You could not leverage it to raise the capital you needed to plant next season's crop. In a single stroke, the entire financial architecture of Zimbabwean agriculture had been frozen solid. This is what economists call dead capital. It's a concept developed by Hernando de Soto, the idea that assets only generate economic energy when they exist within a formal property rights system. A house you own with a title deed can be mortgaged, collateralized, leveraged. A house you occupy without formal title is shelter and nothing more. It cannot circulate through the financial system. It cannot create credit. It sits there, inert. Zimbabwe had just converted 4,000 productive, collateralized, credit-generating commercial farms into 4,000 pieces of dead capital. Overnight. The commercial banks understood this immediately. Agricultural loan portfolios that had been performing assets became non-performing assets in a matter of weeks. Lenders stopped issuing seasonal credit, the short-term financing that farmers depend on every single year to purchase seeds, fertilizer, fuel, and labor before the harvest comes in. Without that credit, the planting cycle broke down. Without planting, there was no harvest. Without a harvest, there were no exports. Without exports, there was no foreign currency. The foreign direct investment numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1998, Zimbabwe attracted approximately $444 million in foreign direct investment. By 2003, that number had collapsed to $3.8 million. That is not a decline. That is an almost complete disappearance, a drop of more than 99% in 5 years. International investors do not move capital into countries where property rights cannot be guaranteed. It is not ideological. It is mechanical. If you cannot legally secure an asset against a loan, if the government can revoke ownership by decree with no compensation and no recourse, then there is no basis for any financial transaction that depends on future certainty. And almost every significant financial transaction depends on future certainty. The government's response to the liquidity crisis was the only tool it had left. It printed money. And then it printed more. And then it kept printing because there was no other mechanism available to fund basic government operations once the foreign currency dried up and the banking system lost its capacity to generate credit. The printing accelerated. The inflation accelerated with it. By November 2008, Zimbabwe's official inflation rate had reached 79.6 billion%. That is not a typo. 79.6 billion%. The currency that had once funded one of Africa's most productive agricultural economies had become, in the space of 8 years, the collector's item you can buy on eBay today for a few dollars. Here's the assumption most people make when they look at this story. They assume the farms stopped producing because the new occupants couldn't farm as well. And there's some truth to that experience matters, and commercial farming at scale requires decades of accumulated knowledge. But that's not the core of what happened. Subsistence farmers in Zimbabwe had been growing food for generations. The problem was never whether people could grow crops. The problem was that the entire financial system that turned crops into capital had been switched off. The credit lines were gone. The collateral was gone. The investment was gone. The foreign currency earnings were gone. You can hand someone a farm. You cannot hand them a banking system. When Emerson Mnangagwa came to power in November 2017, the narrative that went out to the world was one of fresh starts. Mugabe was gone. A new era was beginning. Zimbabwe was open for business. That was the message. That was the press conference. That was the international headline. What the press conference didn't mention was the bill. The government Mnangagwa inherited was sitting on more than $21 billion in frozen external debt. Not disputed debt, not debt under negotiation. Frozen debt arrears that had accumulated over 2 decades of isolation, that had locked Zimbabwe out of the World Bank, out of the IMF, out of virtually every major international lending facility that a government needs access to in order to function. The treasury wasn't just empty. It had been structurally cut off from the pipes that fill treasuries. And here is the part that almost never makes it into the clean version of this story. Some of that debt didn't come from the land crisis. It came from a war that most people outside the region have forgotten about. Zimbabwe's military intervention in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which began in 1998 and ran for years at an estimated cost of around $25 million per month. That figure was never transparently disclosed to the IMF. It was carried off the books, absorbed into the fiscal chaos of the Mugabe era, and left to compound quietly alongside every other liability the new government had inherited. By the time Mnangagwa sat down with his finance ministry, The full scale of what had accumulated was staggering. To unlock any of it, to get sanctions eased, to get debt restructured, to get international creditors back to the table, Zimbabwe needed to demonstrate something specific. Not economic growth, not agricultural recovery, something more fundamental. That the rule of law applied to property. That assets taken by force could, in principle, be returned or compensated. That the country had moved beyond the framework that made it uninvestable in the first place. The African Development Bank was direct about it. Western creditors were direct about it. The message coming from every direction was essentially the same. How are you going to handle the farmers? Not as a moral question, as a financial precondition. In 2020, Zimbabwe signed what became known as the Global Compensation Deed, a formal government commitment to pay $3.5 billion in compensation to approximately 4,500 white farmers whose land and assets had been seized during the fast-track program 2 decades earlier. The signing ceremony was covered as a moment of reconciliation, a government acknowledging a wrong, a country turning a page. But read the financial context around it and the picture looks different. The deed wasn't primarily an act of conscience. It was a diplomatic instrument, a document designed to send a specific signal to a specific audience. The signal was, Zimbabwe has accepted liability. Zimbabwe is re-engaging with international legal norms. Zimbabwe is, in the language of the investment community, open for business again. The practical goal was debt relief, access to new lines of credit, a path back into the international financial system that had been closed since the early 2000s. The farmers themselves understood this. Many had been waiting for more than 20 years. Some had died waiting. The compensation agreement was, for the international community, a key that could unlock new lending arrangements. For the farmers, it was the first formal acknowledgement that what happened to them was not legally permanent. And for the Zimbabwean government, it was a calculated transaction using the fate of 4,500 people as leverage in a negotiation that was fundamentally about something else entirely, the country's access to capital. This is the hidden variable that almost never appears in the agricultural recovery story. The return of white farmers through joint ventures, the tobacco production records, the export revenue, none of it happened in isolation from this wider debt negotiation. The two things were connected. One was the signal, the other was the result. The question is whether the signal was real. In April 2025, Zimbabwe made its first payment toward the $3.5 billion compensation commitment it had signed 5 years earlier. The government issued a press release. There were statements about progress, about commitment, about a new chapter. The language was careful and the tone was optimistic. The amount paid was $3.1 million, not $3.1 billion, not even $310 million. $3.1 million against a total obligation of $3.5 billion. That is less than 0.1% of what was owed. Representatives of the displaced farming community called it tokenistic. Some used harsher language. What it amounted to in practice was a signal not of repayment, but of continued deferral dressed up as progress. And here is where the story stops being about agriculture and starts being about something more fundamental. Whether an economy can actually function when its legal framework for property rights remains structurally broken. Consider the position of the white farmers currently operating inside Zimbabwe's joint venture system. They are running the machines, they are managing the irrigation, they are maintaining the supply chains and the buyer relationships that have driven tobacco output to record levels. They are, in every operational sense, the engine of the agricultural recovery the government is pointing to with pride. But they own nothing. Not the land under their feet, not the equipment they operate in many cases, not any legally enforceable long-term stake in the output they are generating. Zimbabwe's constitution, as amended in 2013, already enshrined a framework that excluded white Zimbabweans from land ownership. And in 2025, the government moved further, passing legislation that restricted agricultural land transfers exclusively to indigenous citizens, closing what remained of any legal pathway through which white farmers might eventually secure formal tenure. The same government that was publicly celebrating record harvests and inviting white expertise back through the side door was simultaneously legislating to ensure that door could never become a front door. This is the institutional trap in its clearest form. You're being asked to invest your knowledge, your capital, your seasonal financing, and your international relationships into a system that explicitly denies you any ownership of what you build. You're being asked to trust a government whose most recent formal payment against a 5-year-old compensation agreement amounted to a rounding error. You are being asked to do this in a country whose treasury bonds are effectively uninvestable on international markets because the last time this government ran out of money, it printed a banknote worth $100 trillion and handed it to people who couldn't buy bread with it. The rational question, the question any foreign investor, any international lending institution, any white farmer weighing whether to renew their joint venture arrangement would ask, is not whether Zimbabwe's agricultural recovery is real. It clearly is, in the short term. The question is whether any of it is durable. Whether the invisible infrastructure being rebuilt through thousands of quiet partnerships can survive the next political decision, the next election, the next ideological shift, the next government that decides the arrangement has served its purpose. Markets don't just price present performance, they price future certainty. And future certainty requires a legal system that applies to everyone. It requires property rights that a government cannot revoke by decree on a Tuesday afternoon. It requires that when a government signs a $3.5 billion obligation and then pays $3.1 million 5 years later, the international community treats that as the default. It actually is not, as an installment plan. Zimbabwe in 2025 is producing record tobacco numbers. It is earning over $1 billion in agricultural export revenue. It is doing so almost entirely on the labor and knowledge of people it has legally excluded from ownership. And it is paying its acknowledged debts to those same people at a rate that, if maintained, would take over 1,000 years to settle. That is not a recovery. That is a contradiction held together by necessity and watched closely by everyone waiting to see which one breaks first. So what does Zimbabwe actually teach us? Not about Africa, not about race, about something more universal than either about the difference between the things you can see and redistribute and the things you cannot. Economists have a term for it: invisible infrastructure. It refers to everything that makes a physical asset productive but cannot be photographed, transferred by decree, or handed over with a set of keys. It includes the credit relationships a farmer builds over decades with international buyers, the institutional knowledge of how to manage a 1,000-hectare irrigation system through a dry season, the reputational track record that allows a commodities exporter to secure financing before the crop even goes in the ground. These things are real. They generate enormous economic value. But they are attached to people, not to land. And when you expel the people, they go with them. This is the lesson Zimbabwe spent 25 years learning in the most painful way possible. The injustice that triggered the land reform was genuine. The Land Apportionment Act of 1930 had locked black Zimbabweans out of the most productive agricultural land in their own country for most of the 20th century. That wound was real. The anger behind the reform was legitimate. A country built on that kind of structural exclusion cannot sustain itself indefinitely, and eventually the pressure finds a release point. The argument for redistribution was not invented. It was earned through generations of dispossession. But the method Mugabe chose did not correct the injustice. It compounded it for everyone. It destroyed the invisible infrastructure that had made the land valuable in the first place. It broke the credit system. It collapsed the export relationships. It eliminated the institutional knowledge that 30 years of commercial farming had produced. And it left behind a country that had the land, but had lost the ability to make the land work, because the ability to make the land work was never in the land itself. You cannot decree a supply chain into existence. You cannot legislate a buyer relationship. You cannot print creditworthiness, as Zimbabwe discovered in November 2008, when it tried to print everything else and ended up with a currency worth less than the paper it was printed on. And here's the deepest irony of all: the record tobacco harvests of 2024. The $1.2 billion in agricultural export revenue, the 2,400 joint ventures quietly producing results across the country in 2025. All of it is being generated right now by the same invisible infrastructure that was expelled in 2000, carried back in by the same people through a side door under arrangements that officially don't exist, into a system that still legally excludes them from owning what they build. Zimbabwe got the outcome it needed. It did not fix the architecture that produced the crisis. The land is still state property. The compensation is still unpaid at any meaningful scale. The legal framework still treats white Zimbabweans as a category to be managed rather than citizens with enforceable rights. The invisible infrastructure is back, but it is operating on borrowed time inside a structure that can revoke it with a single political decision, just as it was revoked 25 years ago. Which brings us to the question this entire story is actually asking. Is what Zimbabwe has built since 2020 a genuine foundation, a pragmatic first step toward the kind of institutional stability that could eventually attract long-term investment, rebuild the credit architecture, and create something durable? Or is it a temporary performance, a diplomatic theater designed to service debt obligations and produce export numbers for international headlines, while the underlying legal structure remains exactly as broken as it was the day the crisis began? Leave your answer in the comments, because the answer determines whether that $100 trillion note stays in the museum or eventually gets company.